All right, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever you might be. Okay, my name is Eric Capistrano, and today we will be discussing the basics of IT governance. So, very briefly before we begin, uh, IT governance is actually one of the newer topics in the sense that the term being used is new. But let me say off the bat that even as early as the 80s or the 90s, practices regarding IT governance have been around for a while. I'll explain in a little bit what this means. So, but right now, the biggest and the most significant reason why IT is given consideration in the discussion of corporate governance is that IT has become very critical to organizations' performances and continuous improvement. Also, it has become more ubiquitous, complex, and sophisticated, deeply embedded in production processes, supply chains, and employees' work. It's everywhere. You have your mobile phones, you have your tablets, you have your laptops. IT is everywhere. And a lot of those are connected to your school work in this case, or a lot of them are connected in your works and tasks in the corporate setting. So as we look at the history of IT in an organization, we understand that organizations adopting IT for simple computerization or automation has been around for decades. So uh, from the old computers, the old printers, even before internet became a thing, there were a lot of computerization and automation that happened as early on. However, even with these simple setups, organizations must comply with regulations and standards in contracting vendors and service providers, like who will be their supplier for their computers, their hard drives, their power supplies, uh, their telephones, and make changes in organization structures and labor force requirements. What was once done manually, now it can be automated. So obviously there will be some changes in job descriptions and even entire organizational structures and numbers in employment. So all we can see there that there's a lot of different effects that are happening, and as probably by now you have realized, this would require a lot of governance structures, so to speak. Yeah. And after all of these changes, they are also required to create new management control mechanisms to adjust to the changes in expected performance. Uh, as simple as like probably using computers for work related purposes only and not for personal use. We all know that that's happening, but how do we control it? How do we enforce that kind of regulation? Or let's say you issue someone a new laptop, there are certain expectations regarding what kind of output should be done by the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the year. So we can see a lot of these different things happening. So it's not just about slapping some IT and then get it over with. That's not it. We need to understand that in IT governance, there is a lot of changes going to happen that would require a lot of management oversight during the course of its changes. So, like I said, governance in IT is not entirely new, and most of these initiatives have been around for a long time. But even that, this is still one of the youngest governance initiatives that is happening around in the field of management. So let's get along with today's agenda. We're going to start with some examples of recent IT related incidences, just to bring home the point, some risks in IT management, some defining. Of course, we need to define what IT governance is all about so that we can all understand everything in the same page. And measuring IT governance practices in an organization will also be a big topic that we'll be discussing in this session. And there will be common IT governance frameworks and approaches that I will be sharing to you. And lastly, we will end today's session with challenges in implementing IT governance. So problems in IT management have been around, for a while. So let's take a look at two recent examples in the Philippines where IT was deeply embedded in the organization's operations. So if you remember the case of Jollibee with Chicken Sad, This was all about a massive IT investment that required significant capital financing and involving particularly its supply chain. So the problem here was that the massive scope and scale of the change obviously required some time. But Jollibee, as the reports went, failed to appreciate the risks and the constraints associated with such a big IT project. So again, so as a result of them having to have this big scope and scale of a project, but the thing is like, as I've said, it requires a massive investment, but it did fail to appreciate the risks involved. We had the chicken sad. It's not that Jollibee did not lose chicken per se. It's just that they didn't have the good management record system to track where the chicken is. So let's make that clear. So it was about the information, the timeliness of it, the accuracy of it that was the problem there. Okay, so another example, just to, to further look into this problem of Jollibee, there were major learning curves and compatibility issues that due to the sudden switch from one major ERP provider to another. So we can see here that it is a big scope and scale, but it was rushed. Management wanted it done in 18 months, and any IT professional would tell you that this is impossible, downright crazy, if you ask me. So, because of these failures, it was also deemed that there was a failure to completely meet staffing requirements, and inadequate testing and demonstrations were also seen as a result of this tight framework that we're seeing. So that being said, with Jollibee, you can see now that there was a mismatch with what management wanted and what is the reality given the scope and scale of their proposed IT work. Another example, and this is a little bit more mundane, also, but a lot has happened also with this particular company is BPI. So the incident with BPI is more procedural and operational in nature. So, however, the overall impact revealed that as to how much the bank and its customers were dependent over the technologies. These errors were found deeply embedded in critical tasks and are part of critical tasks. So, investigations pointed out to lapses and errors in encoding, which, like again, these are supposed to be mundane, but the overall effect of these errors were massive. So errors in the IT supported processes that BPI had were as follows. There was a misposting of transactions that was committed by a data encoder. This led to a chain of internal data processing errors, leading to some double posting that happened there. If you recall the situation with BPI, there was even like a House and Senate investigation on this matter, in which top officials of the bank actually explained to lawmakers what actually happened during this time. So these are some of the things that can happen if there's like even like a slight oversight of IT governance that will be committed for these particular issues. So regardless if the project is a big one or a small one, if it's something that's new or something that's ongoing, we need to have some degree of IT governance here. So let's look first in the risks of IT management. So we have here, as we can see now, like there are natural and environmental risks that we see here. We also see obsolescence risks, and we also see operational and procedural risks. So what are these risks in IT management? So first of all, the risks from natural catastrophes and risks for environmental conditions. Those are the natural and environmental risks. So earthquakes, fires, flooding. If you remember that time, there was like an incident in the PhilHealth office up north that suddenly got flooded because of heavy rains and because there was a leak in the building. That's part of the natural environmental risks. Obsolescence risk. This is something that is quite controversial and a little bit contentious at times, but risks from loss of technical support and risk of increased compatibility issues are some examples of the obsolescence risks. Now, of course, we are familiar with this. Like, we have our mobile phones that every 2 years, every year, they're like quote unquote force us to update or change our phones because like they're going to discontinue the software or they're going to discontinue the support for a particular software and therefore the requirement to change. So yeah, it's a little bit contentious at that point. The third one is operational and procedural risks, and these are the risks from glitches and errors and risks from improper and inappropriate use. So a lot of us probably may be a little bit careless when it comes to like inserting infected flash disks in our computers or downloading from some sketchy website and we don't have the proper security and antivirus protocols and programs installed in our devices so that we can protect ourselves from that. Or sometimes we forget to shut down properly, or there might be some like a power interruption, or somebody tripped over a power cord and things suddenly shut down, stuff like that. These are covered in operational and procedural risks. Now, other risks are involved will be, first of all, the security and privacy risks. There are also reputational, existential, and regulatory risks as well. So security and privacy risks are system breaches and attacks, risk from misuse and abuse of data. So hackers, viruses, these are more on the security and privacy risks. Malware, adware, these are all part of security and privacy risks as well. Reputational, existential, and or regulatory risks are mostly the result of not addressing the previous set of risks that I just mentioned. So risks from compliance failures, risks from negligence. So let's say in the case of Jollibee and B.P.B, as I've said a while ago, they suffered a lot of reputational, existential, and regulatory risks as a result of the media publishing news about the effects of their IT failures. Point. So the thing is like, in the case of today's IT infrastructure and IT trends that we have these days, all of these risks now are increasingly becoming more complex. So IT has become more encompassing, inclusive, ubiquitous, and therefore standards are becoming more demanding. We take selfies, we post ourselves and tell the world where we are and what we are doing on social media. So by doing so, we expose ourselves to some degree of risk there. I remember telling my students in my IT classes that sometimes from a single photo on Instagram, we can actually create an initial profile of that person as to what he or she actually wants. Now, from the business side of things, that's actually good. But of course, that being said, it borders on privacy and ethical issues. So, but then you can have this counter argument. Oh, it's shared in the public sphere. So it becomes a back and forth kind of thing wherein we have to deal with the ubiquity of IT, but at the same time, we have to also be very careful on how we use it. So moving forward now, so just to have like a common ground for us, for all of us. So we need to define what IT governance is. So according to a big organization called the IT Governance Institute, this is a worldwide organization, by the way. IT governance is the responsibility of executives and the board of directors and consists of the leadership, organizational structures, and processes that ensure that enterprise IT sustains and extends the organization's strategies and objectives. Okay. And therefore, IT governance should be a formal and systematic set of policies, rules, practices, and processes. And it has to be made by the highest levels of management, and that would include your board of directors. Probably at this point, you have some idea already of what are the responsibilities of the board of directors as far as corporate governance is concerned. We're just extending the whole thing to include IT governance as well. So it dictates the appropriate practices and processes to mitigate risks due to the IT adoption and use. As I've said a while ago, we have a lot of risks when we do IT. So by having this IT governance structure in place, we do try to mitigate these risks and the resulting effects of it to our organization. Furthermore, these must have controllable and measurable outcomes, and obviously must be consistent with the organization's objectives. So typically, it's nothing new. It's just like we're looking at corporate governance mechanisms, but applied to the IT setting. Okay. So let's take a look at each one. Right? A formal and systematic set of policies, rules, practices, and processes. So that means reminding the organization of IT-related risks, dictating the to-dos while an IT project is being implemented, guiding the organization on how to conduct IT-related audits and internal control. So these are the things that we should see where in these policies, rules, practices, and processes. So made by the highest levels of management, including the board of directors, that means IT governance is a leadership function. It influences the degree and intensity of governance towards IT projects, and the composition of the board actually influences the appreciation of IT-related risks. So the more IT literate your board members are, the more informed they are, the more accurately informed they are, the better your governance structure should be. Dictates appropriate practices and processes to mitigate risks. So these must be consistent with some generally accepted standards, frameworks, and approaches. Just like in accounting, like when you have to follow some certain guidelines, some certain rules on financial reporting. It's the same with IT governance. We have some generally accepted standards, frameworks, and approaches that we can adopt and employ so that we can mitigate these risks. And of course, as with accounting, as with auditing in general, it must be compliant with any external regulations and other government and industry impositions. Next one is its controllable and measurable outcomes and consistent with the organization's objectives. So we must produce tangible and observable outcomes to justify its development, must be in line with the organization's objectives and strategies. So let me give you an example of a framework when it comes to IT governance that would be more palatable and more visual for all of us. So according to the ITGI, the IT Governance Institute, they have 5 areas to be considered for an effective IT governance. And these are strategic alignment, value delivery, resource management, risk management, and performance measurement. So that being said, this means that IT governance must also consider being consistent with the broader corporate governance mechanisms and practices of the organization. It should be in line with the organization's audit and management control practices and defines and emphasizes the active role of the organization's board of directors. So probably except for the third point, for those of you who have taken BA193 management accounting, this should not be something that's foreign or new to you. Or even your basic accounting, that we follow rules. At the time, we try to memorize some of them, right? So that being said, that kind of mindset, that kind of discipline and approach that's needed for us to do accounting and a little bit of auditing and control, it's the same thing. So we want to make sure that these 5 dimensions that you see right now reflects the fact that it has to be consistent with broader corporate governance mechanisms, with reflective of audit and management control practices, and the board of directors has to be actively involved in this practice as well. So let's look at each one, right? So strategic alignment, what does that mean? We link the business into IT. You want to have an IT that would be fully utilized by your business. You don't get IT just for the sake of getting IT. That's crazy. So you need something to define, maintain, and validate the IT value proposition. Why are you getting this ERP system from Oracle or SAP? Or for that matter, why Oracle? Why SAP? Why do you want it out from outside instead of in-house development? What kind of processes that we're going to align the operations of the business with the IT operations? We want to make sure that the functions of the IT system that we're going to have, say an ERP system, would be very much aligned with what we are doing inside the organization. We don't want to have this difficulty wherein there's a mismatch, or there's like we need to create and train new people for completely new processes, etc., etc. So that strategic alignment will ensure that we are getting the IT that we need and we need for the long run. Performance management is the next. So at this point, you are going to be familiar with the balance scorecard to translate strategy into actions and achieve goals. So basically, it's an application of the balance scorecard principle in terms of the IT that you have right now to help you achieve those strategic objectives and goals. You also want to track the IT project delivery and monitor IT-related KPI. Therefore, we end up measuring and reporting IT services. So from that balance scorecard, we can derive some IT-related KPIs there that we see, and then based on those KPIs, we measure, evaluate, and report the IT services that we're getting. It's not just a question of like, oh, this computer sucks. Oh, this program sucks. How does it suck? Right? So even to that point, or there's a problem with my computer. What kind of problem there is there, right? So it's really trying to make things more measurable as far as the performance management is concerned. The third one is your resource management. Investing in IT takes a lot out of your cash flow. And IT projects are very, very expensive. We've seen a lot of stories from our very own EUP to what happened in the Supreme Court with former Chief Justice Sereno, with what we saw in anomalies with field health, and so on and so forth. So it's a lot. It's massive. And that would require millions, if not billions of pesos to actually make the whole thing work. So determining optimal levels of investment, use, and allocation of resources and capabilities is something that we want to consider as far as the resource management for IT is concerned. We also try to optimize knowledge and IT infrastructures. And of course, knowing where and how to outsource. Here's the tricky thing about IT. The fact remains that a lot of the knowledge, the know-how to operate IT has a very fast turnover. What you know today will be obsolete in a couple of years, and the cycles are becoming shorter and more intense for that matter. So I remember back in the day in high school, I learned a lot of programming languages. Computer programming was a high school love of mine. But unfortunately, none of the programming languages that I've learned back then are actually very useful now. So unless I go for legacy systems and all, but my skills as an IT professional is actually obsolete at this point. So That's a tricky part. So you also need to be very vigilant when it comes to the resource management side. You invest on training, you invest on knowledge management, you invest on decide on the appropriate outsourcing partner, and for that matter, that outsourcing partner has to always be kept abreast with the latest trends and developments. Now we're talking about big data and big and data analytics. Everybody's trying to catch up with that, but nobody knows actually how the whole thing works. But rest assured, in a few years' time, that would be replaced by something else. So how do we now keep on going, retaining what should be retained, letting go what should be let go, and learning what should be learned, acquiring what should be acquired throughout all this time. Okay. Fourth one now is risk management. So we want to have a clear understanding of the business appetite for risk and risk transparency, embedding risk management responsibilities in those business operations, safeguarding IT assets, and most importantly, enabling disaster recovery and continuity of operations. Let's go back to the case of Jollibee and BPI. So when Chicken Sad happened in the case of Jollibee, they actually scrambled to ensure that business it's gonna be business as usual. Same with BPI. They resorted to manual processes just to ensure that service can still be delivered while the system is being repaired or problems are being addressed. So the last point that you're seeing here on enabling disaster recovery and continuity of operations is actually one thing that's always being overlooked. It's like the case of you put in a lot of antivirus programs, internet protection programs, but then when your laptop goes down, you cry and because you can't do anything else. So what's your backup plan, in other words? While you're waiting for your laptop to get fixed, the whole world will continue to move around. And so how do we cope with those changes? We need to have backup plans. We need to have contingency plans just to ensure that we are not failing in our obligations to our customers while systems being repaired. IT failures are not an excuse anymore these days to stop operations, unless, of course, it's a really massive one. But for the most part, it is expected that life will go on as IT, the IT problems being addressed. Last one, of course, is the value delivery. Now, this is actually the trickiest part because for the longest time, IT has been considered as what we call a cost center. It's a massive cost center. We sink in a lot of money there. We lose a lot of money there. We have a lot of sunk costs accounted for by IT. So how do we now derive the value of it? So we execute the value proposition throughout the IT project delivery cycle. We want to ensure that it delivers on the benefits consistent with the business strategy. It optimizes IT-related expenses. It controls projects and processes with best practices to ensure success. All well and good, very flowery words, but the reality there is that it's very difficult for IT systems within an organization to be directly tied to revenues. Okay, or directly tied to cost savings. A lot of it would be more of the indirect. It's indirect contributions to revenues, additional revenues, and it's indirect contributions to reduce costs. Because let's face it, on top of the billions of pesos that you need to spend for the computers, the servers, the power cables, the internet, you also have increased electricity costs. You have increased maintenance costs because of it. So it's really a very massive cost item in our financial statements, and obviously we don't like that. So we try to offset it by increased productivity for one, but that's in terms of a non-monetary number. So how do you now convert that non-monetary number into something that is reflective in your financial statements. At the end of the day, it's all about the bottom line. Even the triple bottom line is all about monetary values anyway. So how do we now translate all of that into something that can be reflective in your financial statements? That is where we want to make sure that the value delivery that we get there is visible. In other words, we want to get our money's worth, and we don't want to spend too much on IT just for the sake of having it there. It has to be contributing to productivity, to better output, to efficiency, to increased effectiveness, etc., etc. Okay. So, where's the board of directors in all of this? So, as we can see in this diagram, the board of directors is all about the direct and control functions in the IT management sphere. It requires oversight. IT governance requires oversight, and of course, when you say oversight, we think about the board of directors. So IT governance covers not only the assets and processes related to the system and the technology, but it's also about the content of these assets and processes. So the IT organization sets the objectives and measures for its IT-related projects based on strategic directions. They're the ones who are telling you, this is what we want to see. This is what we want to measure. This is what we want to expect along the way. So it's up to them. It's supposed to be up to them to tell you that. And the IT organization that you see below, it's all about them executing what the board of directors want. So the IT organization performs the activities to realize these objectives, but the board of directors can exercise oversight over the IT organization when it comes to this. Think about it this way. You're going to be asking for a lot of money for this. So you go to your chief financial officer. But to earmark that massive investment, it has to have the approval of the board of directors. So that being said, you want to allow your board of directors to exercise some oversight because they approve 10, 20 billion pesos worth of IT projects, and they don't want to look stupid later on if this fails, right? They want this to succeed. They've committed to it. So they want to execute that oversight over it. But again, it's not just about the hardware and the software. It's about what's inside there, the content, the files, the content of the files. So the kind of programs that you use, the information exchanges that are happening over the internet because of your IT infrastructure. These are things that board of directors would be very much interested in, and therefore that gives them the right to exercise oversight. And as I've said, they should exercise this oversight very carefully. So the next few slides I'm going to show you are some of the practices that we see in industry right now. So one thing that we can do to measure IT governance practices is in an organization is a framework that measures what we call the maturity level of the IT infrastructure and governance that we have in our organization. So I'm not gonna go through each one. I'm just gonna highlight them. All right, maturity level 0 means it's non-existent. So that's a description of it. So maturity level 1 is initial and ad hoc. 2 is repeatable but intuitive. 3 is a more defined process. 4 is managed and measurable. 5 is optimized. So what all of this means is that as you go along the hierarchy of the maturity level, as you notice, the IT governance becomes more formal and institutionalized along the way. So when you go back and look at this, you can use this as an exercise. Like you look at Jollibee and BPI again based on published information, and then try to see where they are. Where is UP, for instance? What maturity level is UP Diliman in right now as far as whatever IT governance structure that we have is concerned? So this is a good start. I kind of recommend that you start with this. So that's more like a diagnostic tool just to see where you are, your organization is, in terms of your present structures. But of course, once that's dealt with, the next part will be how to move forward. How do we improve on it? Or if it's totally non-existent, how do we develop one? So what I'm going to show you next is like common IT governance frameworks and approaches. So the first one is what we call a COBIT framework, control objectives for information related technologies. This is a very popular approach to this. So these are the what you're seeing right now is the description and the focus of it. So COBIT is really more on the why. Why do you need this? Why is this necessary? Why is this necessary? Why is this useful? Why is this value adding to the organization? Okay. So another common approach is the ITIL or ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure Library. This is more on the how. How are we going to do this? How do we ensure that the IT service support is directed towards the core business processes? So this is really more about, okay, it's there. Okay, how do we make it work? So that's what ITIL is all about. Other approaches would include like this one, COSO, COSO, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Tradeway Commission. If you remember back in the 90s, early 2000, when Enron happened, one of the most popular legislations was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, influencing internal control. Think of COSO as the IT governance equivalent of that. A framework that would influence internal control processes within your organization as far as IT is concerned. So some provisions of laws such as Sarbanes-Oxley would be very much influential here in auditing IT-based processes and forming control mechanisms as far as IT governance is concerned. So these are the three most common. There's a lot more that's out there, but as far as what's being adopted and employed, these are the three common frameworks that are being used so that we can address our concerns and develop our own IT governance infrastructure to support the IT infrastructure that we have there. Now, after all that, we want to also look at and appreciate that there are challenges in implementing IT governance. So the first one, the three are like the business terms versus techno speak, the change management issues, and internal development versus external interventions. So that being said, okay, let's look at the first one. Okay, the business terms. Okay, so these are the three. Once again, so let's look at the first one: business terms versus techno speak. So IT requires significantly more technical insight compared to other business disciplines. This is the one inherent weakness of IT. There's a lot of technical terms that admittedly present members of boards of directors are not very familiar with. There's still a lot of people from the boomer and the Gen X era that are not really that fluent or knowledgeable when it comes to the techno speak that IT has. So thing about it, CIOs or the Chief Information Officers influence have declined because of tendencies to use these techno speaks with non-technical executives instead of using terms related to cost, returns, progress, and projects. I am sure a lot of you underwent BA186 and you had to learn a lot of terms, right? DFDs, ERDs, like for a management student, what the hell is that, right? So in my case, I do teach BA186 as well. The thing about that is my point there would be, at least when you talk to a systems analyst when you talk to a programmer, when you talk to a systems developer, you know their language. So that mindset is also very important when it comes to CIO level or even a board level. The marriage between the technical and the techno speak is very important, and it is a big challenge. Too little techno speak can lead to shallow appreciation of IT impacts and risks to the organization on the other hand. So that's the thing. That's the first challenge. How does the CIO, when he or she communicates to board of directors, uh, try to find that compromise, so try to find that delicate balance between the business terms versus the techno speak. So we want to be very conscious of that. Second is dealing with change management issues. So IT governance requires change management competency, obviously. There are going to be a lot of changes happening in your organization. And with that, of course, change management is a must. We want every time you have an IT project, a massive one, most especially, you move the organization towards a new normal or a new steady state. A term that's very appropriate right now, by the way. So yeah, so because of that, uh, how do we now move to that new normal given that the IT is supposed to help us now with our processes? There are new ways to execute old processes or improve ways to execute old processes. How do we do that? And we want to always watch out for change management failures that can also affect IT governance implementation. So resistance to change, not attending the training, the puede na attitude, or like based on experience rather than reading the manuals, and so on and so forth. So what you normally see as problems in change management can also be something to be encountered in implementing IT governance. The last, of course, is the balancing between internal development and external intervention. Many still fall into the trap that IT governance should be done exclusively internally. Yeah. This is actually a valid point because people from the inside know the company best, right? But the thing is, one should not forget the value of user engagement and outside intervention. Here's also the thing about IT governance that's very tricky. A lot of the governance mechanisms are done from the top. And ironically, it doesn't go down to the people who are the actual users. And a lot of this would also be like top down. It may be a little bit more bureaucratic and slower to implement, but top down and then you go bottom up is also very useful because you want to also get the insights of those who are actually in front of the computers, who are actually interfacing with the system. So you also want their insights on it as well. Or for that matter, deciding on choosing the appropriate external IT solutions and services versus developing a system in-house is also one big challenge as well. Of course, we know that a lot of external IT providers can charge you very crazy fees, and it's always cheaper to develop one in-house instead. Use our own expertise, but it kind of depends on the scope and scale and the complexity of the system that you want. Obviously, household names such as SAP and Oracle are trustworthy ones, of course, but of course they are very expensive and there are also some issues regarding, so they're not 100% foolproof. But an in-house, the problem with an in-house system is that it can be very rigid and it's not too flexible when changes in management happen or changes in organizational structures happen. That's a lot of external solutions can actually afford to have. So, yes, the company insiders know the company best, but external perspectives can also give us a fresh take of things. Think about the usual issues as well of make or buy or in-house versus outsourcing. Recall those issues, and those same issues also apply to IT governance as well. So At this point, of course, what we are seeing here right now is just basically a primer of the thing of what IT governance is all about. But here's let me emphasize the point that I shared at the beginning. IT governance is all about what you know about corporate governance, what you know about audit, what you know about operations audit for that matter, what you know about management control, what you know about internal control, you apply that to the IT setting. Once you try to, you understand that, once you appreciate that, then it actually becomes a lot easier for you to understand what IT governance is. And admittedly, even though it's been 2 years since I first wrote this article, wrote this chapter in your textbook, but the field is still constantly changing and evolving because of the fact that IT itself is still constantly evolving and changing. We have IT governance structures for ERPs, but right now, because of what big data is blurring as far as ethics and privacy and security is concerned, IT governance mechanisms are scrambling to catch up. And that's just one example of the whole thing. So, yeah. So, like I said, this whole thing about IT governance, it's still a new and growing field. And we hope that in the future we can have more concrete stuff, more concrete measures, and more concrete approaches to make this materialize in our respective organizations.